I've said in many of my previous videos that I have some biases and I like to rant about certain things. And one of those things is around surveys and the way we survey customers as companies. And I can't tell you how many companies will send out 39 question, 3-page long surveys that take half hours to complete. And you get all this data back, and then, like I always talk about with KPIs, they're not really correlated to outcomes. And so there's a survey methodology that we talk about a lot that I think is incredibly effective and, more importantly, does not fatigue your customers, called Net Promoter Score. A guy named Fred Reichhold wrote the book The Ultimate Question. That's the book on Net Promoter Score. But boiled down very simply, it's either a 0 to 10 or a 1 to 10 scale, just like a normal survey. The question is very simple, based on blank. So it might be, based on your buying experience at Amazon, how likely would you be to recommend us to a friend? That's the question. And it shows up in lots of flavors. I'll talk a little bit about employee Net Promoter Score in a moment because I think that's equally important. But the question shows up in multiple ways, but at the end of the day, based on your experience, how likely would you be to tell somebody else? Now, where Net Promoter Score, where the magic happens, is in how it's actually scored. So 0 to 6 actually does not count 0 to 6. It counts as a -1. So that person would be very likely to say something bad and be what they call in the book a detractor. So if they have the opportunity to talk about your company, they're probably going to say something negative to somebody else. A 7 and 8 would be scored a 0, so they're neutral. And then 9s and 10s are scored a 1, and they would be a promoter. So literally net promoter means add up all the promoters, add up all the detractors, and the net of those two numbers. So let's say, for instance, you had 75 promoters, you had 5 neutral, and you had 20 detractors. That would be 75 minus 20, so it would be 55 out of a group of 100. Your Net Promoter Score would be 55. So it's the net of detractors and promoters. And so your score range, instead of 0 to 100, like traditional surveys, is -100 to +100. So why does it matter to measure promoters as opposed to the traditional survey methodology where you get 100 scores, you take the average, and that becomes your score? Because somebody that is a 6 is not 6 times happier with your business than somebody who is a 1. A 6 and a 1 are both likely to say something negative given the opportunity to talk about your company. And a 10 is certainly maybe 10 times better than a 1, but it's significantly better than a 6 as well. If you're just taking the average of the 0 to 10 scores, you're not really getting to the heart of how Net Promoter can be valuable in your business. So we use Net Promoter Scores at Appletree, my call center company. We used them in all of our offices, and we were able to track by office what the Net Promoter Score is. Incredibly high correlation to the outcome, which was customer retention. High customer Net Promoter Scores by office typically had high customer retention. But where we got tremendous value out of Net Promoter was how we used the surveys when they came back. So it's only one question. That's incredibly important. You don't lump the Net Promoter question in with 29 other questions and hope that they get to that one and answer it. By only asking one question, you really up the response rate dramatically. But after the question, there's also a response section that basically just says comments. So it's the opportunity to write free form comments after the question. So we would take all the 0 to 6 responses and we would give those obviously to customer service. These customers are unhappy. Why don't we call them and find out what's going on and see if we can fix their problem? Everybody, that's pretty common sense. But the 7s and 8s are the ones that are kind of happy. They're close to being a 9 and 10. They're not unhappy. They're not going to say anything negative, but they're probably not going to say anything positive. But they're so close. How could we get them over the hurdle? So what we would do is we would give them to the operations manager at that site. So it did two things. One, it was a chance for us to talk to that customer and see if we could move them into the promoter range. But it was giving that operations manager all this data subconsciously by having to make all these phone calls. And oftentimes that manager then could make little incremental improvements in how they're running their particular facility, and we would end up with a whole lot more promoters. But the real magic was, and our salespeople hated it, but we gave them the 9s and 10s. Now, why would we give sales the 9s and 10s? Not to ask for more sales. In fact, they were specifically forbidden to ask for more sales. Instead, what they would do is they would call the 9s and 10s and they would say, hey, it was very simple. Hey, we just want to say thank you. You scored us a 10 on a recent survey. That's great. We really appreciate it. I'm calling to say thank you. Can you share the one or two things that really are, that we're doing that make you, a 10 happy? And what we were doing there subconsciously, again, having a dialogue with the customer, which is always great, but we were putting all these positive patterns in the salespeople's subconscious so that when they were talking to prospects, they were naturally telling some of these stories about, oh yeah, I was talking to a customer last week and he loves how friendly we are when we answer the phone, and we had a whole conversation about it. We do this thing called Net Promoter. They scored us a 10, and so you're giving that salesperson constant reinforcement on all the things that are going well in the business. And now when you sell prospects, you're selling against the features that you're the best at, the things that are going really well, and you're kind of creating naturally positive customer relationships. To use a Bob Cialdini term, you're kind of persuading or setting the mind of the prospective customer as they become a customer in advance about all the things that you do well. And we all know salespeople need all the positive reinforcement they can get. This was our daily dose. They typically would make a couple of these calls a day. This was sort of our daily dose of positive reinforcement for the sales team. So Net Promoter, an incredibly powerful tool, incredibly useful, and most importantly, does not create the survey fatigue that most normal surveys do for customers. So really easy to deploy and implement.